Snow fell heavy over Boise that night. On a cold bench at the bus stop, a little girl in a torn pink dress clutched her teddy bear. Her lips quivered, her eyes stayed shut, alone. People walked past, a man in a suit, a mother with a stroller, teenagers laughing. Not one of them stopped. To them, she was just another shadow in the winter night. But fate was not done with her, because someone broken, someone unexpected, was about to see what no one else would. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The winter night in Boise pressed down heavy, the air biting with frost and the streets glazed with silence. Snow tumbled under the dim bus stop light, collecting on the roof, clinging to the glass, painting the city in dull silver. On that frozen bench, a child lay small as a shadow against the storm. Charlotte Carter, 7 years old, golden hair tangled and stiff with snow, curled tightly in a faded pink dress that had seen too many days and too little care. The thin fabric clung to her like paper against fire, torn at the seams, smudged with grime. In her arms she held a stuffed bear, worn thin, its seams open, its button-eye dull, yet her grip fierce as though letting go meant surrendering the last anchor she had in the world. Her chest rose faintly, her lips parted in shallow breaths that fogged weakly in the air. She did not stir as footsteps passed. The city moved on, blind. A man in a suit, shoulders hunched, stared into the glow of his phone. A mother pushed a stroller, speaking hurriedly into the device pressed to her ear. Eyes narrowed, not by concern, but by the urgency of her own world. Two teenagers laughed as they slipped by, the sound ricocheting into the cold air. Not one slowed. To them, the figure on the bench was no more than another shadow in winter, an inconvenience the snow would swallow. Through the storm walked Elijah Ward, 40 years old, his frame lean, shoulders slightly bent, his coat frayed at the sleeves. His hair was cut close but uneven, streaked with gray that seemed older than his years. A rough stubble darkened his jaw, the mark of a man who rarely looked in a mirror. His eyes, deep and restless, carried shadows from a war that had ended long ago, yet never left him. Once a soldier in Iraq, he had seen more than he could tell, and brought home wounds that no doctor could stitch. Nights haunted him with the faces of men he could not save, and days hollowed him with the silence of a life no longer fitting. Work was fleeting, money scarcer still. He lived on the edges of Boise, in a room too small to be called home, with only one companion who had never left. That companion walked at his side now, Ranger, a German shepherd 5 years old, with strong black and tan fur, amber eyes alert even in the storm. Muscled but lean, Ranger moved with purpose, nose twitching, ears flicking at every whisper of sound. Elijah had found him at a shelter years ago, and the bond between them had carried both man and dog through nights when despair seemed louder than breath. Ranger was loyal in the way only animals could be, without question, without condition. Elijah passed the bus stop without slowing, his gaze downward, his thoughts miles away. His boots crunched softly against the snow, the rhythm steady, as though each step could drown out the weight in his head. He did not see the small figure under the glass. He did not allow himself to. The city was full of shadows, and his life had no room for another. But Ranger stopped, his ears perked, his nose flared. He let out a sharp bark, sudden and cutting through the quiet night. Elijah froze, turned, irritation flickering first, then confusion. "What is it, boy?" he muttered, his voice low and tired. Ranger barked again, pulling slightly at the leash, eyes fixed on the bench. Elijah followed the gaze, and for the first time saw her. A small bundle curled against the storm, golden hair strewn across her face, lips pale, dress fluttering with the wind that cut through the shelter's cracks. The stuffed bear clutched in her arms looked older than her years, the kind of toy that had been loved too hard, too long. Elijah's breath caught, his body rooted as memories surged. He saw himself, a boy once left alone, cold and invisible, waiting for someone who never came. He felt the echo of nights spent with hunger gnawing his stomach, of strangers' eyes sliding away. His chest tightened, not only with recognition, but with fear. He looked again at Charlotte, fragile and silent, and then away. His jaw clenched, his hands tightened into fists inside his frayed coat. He could not afford this. He had nothing. No money, no home worth sharing, no strength left to give. He had Ranger, and Ranger was all. To take in a child was madness. To care was to open himself to failure all over again. For a moment he turned, the snow stinging his eyes, his body urging him to keep walking. He could pretend he had never seen. He could let the city take her, as it had taken so many. He had survived by keeping his world small, and one glance at the girl on the bench threatened to tear it open. Ranger barked again, softer now, almost a whine, pulling Elijah's gaze back. The dog stood firm, eyes never leaving the child, chest rising with steady urgency. Elijah exhaled, breath clouding the cold air. His heart wavered between the weight of his own emptiness and the unbearable sight of another abandoned soul. He stood there in the snow, caught between steps, caught between his own survival and the silent plea lying on that bench. His thoughts churned, the storm around him a mirror of the storm inside. And as he lingered, one question pressed against him, sharp and relentless. If he walked away now, could he live with himself tomorrow? Elijah Ward stood in the snow, his breath a ghost in the freezing air, his boots rooted though every instinct told him to keep walking. Ranger pressed closer, tail stiff, eyes fixed on the fragile child sprawled on the bench. The dog let out another soft bark, more plea than warning. Elijah's chest tightened. He had fought battles with bullets and fire, but this battle, the war inside, was always the hardest. His life was already a ruin. What business did he have stepping into someone else's despair? And yet, the thought of walking away left him more terrified than the idea of staying. Finally, he cursed under his breath and turned back. He approached slowly, kneeling at the bench, his knees biting into the ice beneath it. Up close, Charlotte looked even smaller. Her face was pale, lips cracked, the faint freckles across her cheeks almost lost under the frost. A strand of golden hair clung to her damp forehead. Her pink dress was threadbare, the fabric clinging to her bony shoulders. Elijah reached out, his hands trembling, and laid 2 fingers against her neck. The pulse he found was rapid, shallow, feverish. He leaned closer, whispering her name after glimpsing it scrawled faintly in marker on the bear's paw. Charlotte. She did not stir, but her lips parted, and a sound emerged so frail it felt like a knife against his ribs. "Mama!" Elijah swallowed hard, memories storming through him. Once, long ago, he too had cried out for someone who never came. That echo of abandonment became the scar that shaped his manhood. Now, here was another child voicing the same plea, and to walk away would mean betraying not only her, but the boy he had once been. He pulled off his own coat, faded olive with patches at the elbows, and wrapped it around her small body. The fabric swallowed her frame, but still she trembled. Ranger, sensing the urgency, leapt onto the bench, curling his large body against the girl's side, his thick fur pressing warmth into her. Elijah hesitated only a moment longer before sliding his arms under Charlotte. She was lighter than he expected, her limbs limp, head lolling against his chest. The teddy bear stayed trapped in her grip, as if fused to her hand. He rose slowly, clutching her close, his jaw clenched tight to keep the swell of fear from breaking loose. Ranger fell into step beside him, ears alert, as Elijah began the long walk toward the only shelter he had to offer. The journey back to his building was not long, but each step seemed heavier. Boise's streets were nearly empty, lamps casting narrow cones of light on the slick sidewalks. Elijah passed a homeless man huddled under a tarp near the alley, his gray beard stiff with frost, his eyes hollow, but briefly curious at the sight of a child in Elijah's arms. He muttered something unintelligible before sinking back into silence. Elijah's throat burned with the realization that the world was full of forgotten souls, and now he carried one more. His building loomed at the edge of a quiet street, a squat structure of peeling paint and cracked brick. Inside, the hall smelled of mildew and stale smoke. The landlady, Mrs. Donnelly, happened to be shuffling down the stairs as Elijah entered. She was a stout woman in her late 60s, with thinning gray hair pulled back in a bun, a faded housecoat wrapped around her stocky frame. Her eyes, sharp and suspicious, flicked to the bundle in Elijah's arms. "Who's that?" she demanded, her voice raspy from years of cigarettes. Mrs. Donnelly was known among the tenants for her bluntness. She had lived alone since her husband's death, and her mistrust of others had hardened into habit. A kid, Elijah muttered, shifting Charlotte closer, unwilling to explain more. Mrs. Donnelly frowned, her lips pressing into a thin line. You bring trouble into this place, Ward. I'll throw you out. You know I don't take kindly to freeloaders. Her gaze softened just a fraction as she noticed Ranger trotting loyally at Elijah's side, ears low, eyes steady. She had always tolerated the dog more than the man, perhaps because Ranger gave her no reason to distrust him. With a sniff, she shuffled away, muttering about heating bills. Elijah pushed through the narrow hallway to his room. The space was scarcely more than a box. A thin mattress pushed against the wall, a second-hand table with one unsteady leg, a small heater that rattled when it ran. The wallpaper was stained with years of damp, and the single window was fogged from the inside. It was no place for a child, but it was all he had. He laid Charlotte carefully on the mattress, propping her head with his rolled-up blanket. Her skin glowed with fever, her breathing shallow. Ranger leapt onto the bed and lay at her side, his warm body forming a shield. Elijah knelt, pressing the back of his hand to her forehead. The heat startled him. She would not last long without care. But care cost money, and hospitals demanded insurance, things Elijah did not have. He sat back, dragging a hand down his tired face, wrestling with the old enemy of despair. He forced himself to act. He filled a chipped mug with water from the sink, returned to her side, and gently touched the rim to her lips. At first, nothing happened. Then a faint swallow. Encouraged, Elijah tipped another drop, then another, until she had taken enough to ease her cracked throat. He adjusted his coat around her small body, then pulled a threadbare blanket from the corner to lay her on top. Ranger shifted, pressing his nose against Charlotte's cheek, whining softly. The girl stirred faintly, her eyes fluttering open for a heartbeat. Blue eyes, dulled by fever, flicked toward Elijah, but saw nothing clear. She whispered again, "Mama," before slipping back into unconsciousness. The sound made Elijah press his fist hard against his mouth, as if to dam the tide inside. He sat there for a long time, watching her small chest rise and fall. Memories tugged at him, of nights in foreign deserts, of comrades who had called for help and received none, of his own childhood nights on cold floors. He had learned to armor his heart against the cries of others, because to care was to bleed. And yet, here he was, his armor cracked open by the fragile body of a 7-year-old girl. He leaned back against the peeling wall, exhaustion weighing on him, Ranger's steady breathing filling the room. For the first time in years, Elijah felt the stirrings of something he thought he had lost, the dangerous spark of responsibility, and with it, the faintest flicker of hope. The heater in Elijah's small room rattled like an old engine, the noise filling the silence as weak warmth spread unevenly across the damp walls. He sat hunched near the battered stove, a dented pot balanced above the burner, steam curling upward as water began to boil. The faint scent of rust and stale wood hung in the air, the smell of a space lived in too long without care. On the mattress, under his patched coat and a thin blanket, Charlotte lay still, her cheeks flushed red with fever, her tiny body trembling despite Ranger pressed firmly against her side. The German shepherd's thick fur created a barrier of warmth, his steady breathing a rhythm that soothed even Elijah's nerves. Elijah stirred the pot slowly, waiting for the water to cool, then poured it into an old mug. His hands, calloused and cracked from years of labor, trembled slightly as he carried it across the room. He knelt by the mattress and tilted the mug to Charlotte's lips. At first her mouth remained slack, unresponsive, but then her throat worked weakly, taking a sip, then another. Relief touched his face, deepening the creases at his eyes. He set the mug down and brushed damp strands of hair from her forehead, the heat of her skin biting against his fingers. Hours passed, in restless watching until the child stirred, a small sound escaping her lips. Her eyelids fluttered, revealing pale blue eyes dulled by exhaustion. They moved about the room with confusion before settling on Elijah's face. For a long moment, she simply stared, as though unsure if he was real. Her small hand clutched the teddy bear tighter, then she whispered, her voice fragile, "Where's Mama?" Elijah exhaled slowly. He had expected many questions, but that one pierced deeper than he imagined. "You're safe here," he said, his tone low and rough from years of disuse. "Rest now." but Charlotte shook her head, strands of hair falling into her face. "Mama's sick. She can't get up." Her voice cracked, and she buried her face in the bear's worn fur. Elijah felt the weight of her words. He leaned back against the peeling wall, rubbing his jaw where the stubble scratched his palm. He had seen sickness before, men burning with fever in desert tents, comrades gasping under shrapnel wounds, but the image of a woman left too ill to rise, while her child froze at a bus stop, filled him with both rage and grief. Charlotte's small voice broke again. "Rick says she cries too much. He doesn't like me. He tells me to be quiet." The way she said the name Rick was flat, almost rehearsed, as though she had repeated it too many times, her eyes lowered, avoiding Elijah's gaze. She hugged the bear until her knuckles whitened, her lips trembling as if afraid even to share this truth. Elijah clenched his fists, the veins on the back of his hands standing out. Richard Rick Hayes. Though the child had given only a name, Elijah imagined the type easily, a man who turned his back on those who needed him most. He had known men like that in uniform, officers who ignored the suffering of their own, and he despised them with a soldier's fury. He closed his eyes, steadying his breath. Anger would not help her now. Ranger seemed to sense the shift in the room. The dog lifted his head, pressing his muzzle against Charlotte's shoulder, letting out a soft whine. Charlotte's lips quivered into the faintest smile as her small fingers buried themselves in the thick black and tan fur. For the first time since she opened her eyes, the tension in her body eased. She whispered, "He's warm." Elijah watched this, his chest tightening. Ranger had always been his shield when the night terrors came, grounding him when the past clawed back. Now, seeing the dog curl closer to the girl, he recognized the same comfort being passed to her. The innocence in her small smile stirred memories he had buried. He remembered being a boy on a church step, clutching a blanket too thin against the cold, waiting for a father who never came home. He remembered the bitter taste of abandonment, the silence of doors closed against him. He rose, pacing the length of the cramped room, his boots scuffing against the worn floorboards. He glanced at the window, frost edging the glass, the city lights faint beyond. Every instinct told him to keep distance, to remain detached. Caring meant pain. Yet when he looked back at Charlotte, her eyes heavy with sadness too large for her age, he felt the walls inside him begin to crack. A knock rattled faintly at the door, and Elijah tensed. He opened it to find one of the other tenants, Frank Dalton, standing in the hallway. Frank was in his mid-50s, tall but slouched, with thinning brown hair slicked back, a permanent smell of alcohol lingering around him. His cheeks were ruddy, his eyes bloodshot, and his coat hung loosely over a frame grown thin. He had once worked as a mechanic, but had lost steady employment after a drinking problem cost him his license. Despite his flaws, Frank was not cruel, merely broken in his own way. "You got company?" Frank asked, squinting past Elijah into the room. His voice carried the slur of late-night liquor. Elijah shifted to block his view. "Not your concern," he replied flatly. Frank shrugged, muttered something about rent, and shuffled down the hall. Elijah shut the door, locking it firmly. Charlotte had watched the exchange with wide eyes. "Who was that?" she asked softly. "No one you need to worry about," Elijah answered, his tone clipped, then softened when he saw her shrink back. He sat again by her side, his voice quieter. "Rest now. You're safe here." The girl closed her eyes, her small hand still resting on Ranger's fur. Within minutes, her breathing steadied, deeper now, no longer shallow gasps. Elijah sat back, exhausted but restless. His mind churned with questions. Where exactly was her mother? How sick was she? And what kind of man would abandon a child like this? He stared at the ceiling, paint flaking above, the sound of Ranger's steady breathing the only comfort in the room. As dawn hinted at the horizon, Elijah knew one thing. The broken soldier who had once given up on saving others now had a choice to make. The child's sorrow mirrored his own, and in her eyes, he had seen himself. He was no longer sure he could turn away. The morning crept into Boise with a dim, gray light, the kind of dawn that carried no warmth, only a warning of another day of cold. Elijah Ward pulled his worn jacket tight as he stepped into the brittle air, leaving Charlotte curled under his coat and Ranger's protective warmth back in the room. The memory of her weak voice the night before, "Mama's sick," had gnawed at him through the restless hours. He could not silence it, no matter how hard he tried to bury himself in exhaustion. Now his boots carried him toward the hospital, each step heavy, his breath forming pale ghosts that trailed behind him. Ranger padded beside him, ears alert, as if sensing the weight of his master's thoughts. The hospital rose from the city's edge, a squat building of faded brick and two bright glass doors. Elijah pushed through into the lobby, and immediately the sterile smell of disinfectant and burnt coffee flooded his senses. His eyes narrowed against the fluorescent lights, his jaw tightening. Memories came uninvited. Waiting rooms overseas where soldiers sat bleeding while clerks asked for paperwork. Nights in clinics back home where his own fever had burned high, and no one moved to help because he had no insurance card to lay down. At the reception desk sat a young woman, Anna Lopez, no older than 25. She had dark hair pinned neatly into a bun, a slim figure wrapped in a pale blue sweater, her nails tapping nervously on the counter as she scrolled a computer screen. Her brown eyes were tired, rimmed with faint shadows, suggesting long shifts and little sleep. She glanced up at Elijah without interest, the way someone looks at another name on a form. "Can I help you?" Her voice was polite but perfunctory, clipped by routine. "I'm looking for Clara Carter," Elijah said, his voice rough. "She's sick. I was told she came here." Anna typed into her computer, her lips pressing into a line. "Carter, Clara. Yes, she was admitted yesterday. Technically not admitted," she corrected herself, glancing toward him. "She's in waiting. No insurance. We can't officially bring her in until paperwork is sorted." The words made Elijah's chest tighten. "Where is she?" Anna hesitated, then pointed down a hallway. "Observation lounge, last chair against the wall." Elijah nodded stiffly and walked away, Ranger at his side. His boots echoed along the linoleum, each step dragging up fragments of his past. The time he had been left sweating on a plastic chair for 6 hours, shaking from fever, ignored until a volunteer finally brought him water. He clenched his fists now, forcing the images back, but they clung stubbornly. The observation lounge was a bleak space, rows of plastic chairs, paint peeling at the edges of the walls, a vending machine buzzing in the corner. Most of the seats were empty, save for one occupied by a woman slumped weakly, her head resting against the wall. Clara Carter, no older than 32, was striking not for beauty but for the fragility etched into her frame. She was tall but too thin, her collarbones sharp against the neckline of a faded sweater. Her hair, chestnut brown and unkempt, stuck to her damp forehead. Her skin was pale, almost gray, except for the flushed patches across her cheeks where fever burned. She lifted her head slightly when Elijah approached, her eyes a tired shade of blue, the same color Charlotte's had been when they fluttered open in his room. Her gaze was glassy, unfocused, but softened when it landed on Ranger, who stood quietly, ears tilted forward. "Who are you?" Clara's voice was hoarse, a whisper that seemed to cost her. Elijah lowered himself onto the chair beside her. "Name's Elijah Ward. I found Charlotte last night. She was alone at the bus stop." Clara's lips trembled, her hand clutching weakly at the edge of her sweater. She shouldn't have been there. I told Rick to look after her while I—" Her words broke into a cough, harsh and racking, leaving her trembling. Elijah reached out instinctively, steadying her shoulder. Ranger stepped closer, pressing his muzzle gently against Clara's hand. She blinked in surprise, then let her fingers curl faintly into the dog's fur. Elijah studied her face. There was strength beneath the frailty, the stubborn endurance of someone who had tried too long to hold everything together. But her body was failing her, and the system had already turned its back. He looked down the hallway where nurses hurried past with clipboards and IV poles, none sparing a glance for the woman burning up against the wall. The anger rose in him like a tide. He remembered sitting just like this after his discharge, ignored because he was no longer useful to the machine of war, a soldier without insurance, without purpose. That memory had shaped him, hollowed him, made him believe that help was never coming. But now, as he looked at Clara, he knew he could not let Charlotte's mother endure the same abandonment. Clara's voice pulled him back. "Is she safe?" "Yes," Elijah said firmly. "She's with me, warm. Ranger won't leave her side." Clara exhaled in relief, her body sagging against the chair. Her eyes glistened, though she was too exhausted for tears. "Thank you." For a moment, Elijah sat in silence, the weight of his decision pressing against him. He had nothing. No money, no home fit for a child, no power to change the hospital's cold rules. And yet, he had already chosen. He would not walk away this time. Not from Charlotte. Not from Clara. Ranger leaned into his leg, amber eyes steady, as if echoing the vow Elijah had not yet spoken aloud. The waiting lounge of the hospital hummed faintly with the buzz of fluorescent lights, punctuated by the occasional rattle of a vending machine dispensing cans of soda to tired visitors. Elijah Ward sat rigidly on the edge of his chair, Ranger lying alert at his feet, while Clara Carter rested weakly against the wall, her breath shallow and uneven. The hospital's indifference pressed heavy on him, but his thoughts were already racing toward the next problem: Charlotte's stepfather. The man's name had come like a bitter taste from Charlotte's lips the night before. Rick. It wasn't long before the man appeared, striding into the lounge with the kind of swagger born not of confidence, but of arrogance. Richard Rick Hayes was in his mid-40s, tall and broad-shouldered, but gone soft with neglect. His gut pushed against a leather belt, his hands adorned with gaudy rings that flashed under the harsh lights. His face bore the roughness of poor habits: ruddy skin, a patchy beard untrimmed along his jaw, and eyes the color of muddy water, sharp but empty. His thinning hair, slicked back with too much gel, only accentuated the lines of impatience carved into his forehead. His posture carried the air of someone who believed the world owed him comfort, and his gaze scanned the room with irritation rather than concern. He stopped when he saw Elijah, his eyes narrowing, as though the presence of another man irritated him more than the sight of Clara slumped sick in her chair. "Who the hell are you?" Rick demanded, his voice coarse, the kind that had barked orders at people too powerless to resist. Elijah's jaw tightened, his hand unconsciously resting on Ranger's head. "Name's Elijah Ward. I found Charlotte last night, alone, at a bus stop." Rick scoffed, rolling his shoulders. "Figures. The brat wanders off, and now strangers bring her home, always causing trouble, just like her mother." His tone dripped with disdain as his eyes flicked toward Clara, who coughed weakly, too tired to argue. Ranger rose to his feet, fur bristling, a low growl vibrating in his chest. The sound was deep and warning, enough to make a nurse at the far desk glance over nervously. Rick stepped back half a pace, but forced a smirk, as though refusing to show unease. "Control your mutt," he snapped. Elijah stood slowly, his tall, lean frame casting a shadow over Rick. His eyes, once dulled by exhaustion, now burned with quiet fire. "She's 7 years old," he said, voice low and steady. She was freezing out there, clutching a stuffed toy like it was all she had left. "And you're telling me that's her fault?" Rick's smirk hardened into a sneer. "She and Clara are nothing but a drain. You think I got time or money to waste on a woman who cries at every little cough? Or a kid who can't keep her head straight? They're not my blood, not my responsibility." The words hit like a physical blow. Elijah's fists curled at his sides, his mind flashing back to desert nights when comrades had been left behind by men who claimed they were not my problem. He had sworn never to become that man, never to let neglect dictate life or death. Yet here stood Rick, shrugging off a sick woman and her child as if they were broken tools. Clara stirred weakly, her voice cracking. "Rick, please, she's just a child." Rick waved a dismissive hand, his heavy ring catching the light. "And she's your problem, not mine. You want to coddle her? Fine. But don't expect me to carry dead weight." At that moment, a small figure appeared at the doorway. Charlotte. Wrapped in Elijah's coat, her hair still tangled from sleep, she had insisted on following when she woke and found him gone. She clutched her bear tightly, her blue eyes wide as she heard Rick's words. "Please, don't leave me," she whispered, her small hand reaching desperately for Elijah's. Her fingers curled around his calloused palm, trembling with fear. Elijah froze, the words piercing through him. Ranger pressed close, his growl deepening, body positioned between Charlotte and Rick. For years, Elijah had carried nothing but the weight of his own brokenness, refusing attachments, believing he had nothing left to give. But the warmth of Charlotte's small hand, the desperate plea in her voice, cracked something inside him. The soldier who had built walls around his heart felt them crumble, replaced with a flood of fierce protectiveness. He crouched, meeting her eyes. "I won't," he said firmly. "I'm not going anywhere." Rick snorted, rolling his eyes. "What? You want to play daddy now? Be my guest. But don't come running when you figure out what a burden they are." He turned on his heel, muttering curses as he shoved through the exit doors, his presence leaving a trail of stale cologne and resentment behind. The room fell silent except for Clara's ragged breathing and Charlotte's quiet sobs muffled against her bear. Elijah stood, his hands still wrapped around the girls, Ranger pressed close against them both. The decision had already been made in his heart long before he spoke it aloud. He would not let Charlotte or Clara face this storm alone. The cold air of Boise cut against Elijah Ward's face as he stepped outside the hospital with Charlotte holding tightly to his hand and Ranger trotting close at his side. Clara had been left resting in a cot in the observation lounge, her body too weak to protest, her breath shallow but steady. Elijah's chest ached with the memory of Rick's words, still echoing like gunfire in his ears. A burden. He looked down at the small hand clutching his and knew with certainty that Charlotte was no burden. She was a fragile spark, and he would not let her go out. The following morning found him standing before a squat brick building with a faded sign that read, Boise Veterans Resource Center. Its flagpole leaned slightly, the stars and stripes snapping in the winter wind. Elijah hesitated before pushing the glass door open, a rush of warm air carrying the faint scent of stale coffee and paper. He hadn't been in a place like this for years. Memories of group meetings, men broken in different ways, and counselors with sympathetic eyes all came back in sharp fragments. Behind the reception desk sat Sarah Donovan, a woman in her early 50s with a tall, lean frame and a presence that filled the room without effort. Her auburn hair was streaked with gray, tied back neatly, and her green eyes were sharp, carrying both warmth and command. Lines around her mouth and eyes told of years spent listening, comforting, and pushing stubborn men like Elijah to face themselves. She wore a wool cardigan over a collared shirt, and when she looked up, her expression softened only slightly. "Elijah Ward," she said, recognition flickering across her face. "It's been a long time." Elijah shifted uncomfortably, rubbing the back of his neck. "Didn't expect you'd remember." Sarah gave a faint smile. "I don't forget the ones who disappear. What brings you back?" He hesitated, his throat tight. "Not for me, for someone else. A woman, Clara Carter. Sick. Hospital won't take her. She's got a little girl." He glanced down at Charlotte, who clung shyly to Ranger's fur, her wide blue eyes peeking out from behind the dog. Sarah's gaze softened further as she knelt slightly to meet Charlotte's eye level. "And who might you be?" "Charlotte?" the girl whispered, her voice timid. Ranger nudged her side gently, earning a faint giggle that broke the tension. Sarah smiled warmly before standing again. "All right, Elijah, let's talk." She led them into a modest office with mismatched chairs and old posters of mountain landscapes. A heater rattled noisily in the corner. Elijah sat stiffly, Charlotte settling beside him, with Ranger sprawling at their feet. Sarah leaned forward on her desk, studying him with that piercing look he remembered from years ago. "You're asking for help," she said quietly. "That's not something you used to do." Elijah's jaw tightened. "I don't have a choice. The girl, she reminds me too much of—" He stopped, his voice faltering as images of fallen comrades, of abandoned children in dusty streets overseas, flooded his mind. His chest constricted, sweat forming along his brow though the room was cool. The flashback hit hard. The rattle of the heater became gunfire in his ears. The flicker of fluorescent light twisted into the flare of explosions. His breath came fast, his hands trembling. He pressed his palms against his eyes, trying to ground himself. "Elijah!" Sarah's voice broke through firmly, calm but commanding. "Breathe. You're here. Not there." Ranger stood, pressing his head against Elijah's thigh, letting out a soft whine. Charlotte, frightened but determined, climbed onto Elijah's knee and wrapped her arms around him, her teddy bear squished between them. Her small voice whispered, "It's okay. You're safe." The storm inside him cracked. He wrapped an arm around her, his chest rising and falling raggedly until the hallucination ebbed. When he opened his eyes again, Sarah was watching quietly, her expression neither pitying nor judgmental. "That's why I stayed away," Elijah muttered hoarsely. And yet, you're here, Sarah replied simply. That tells me you know this fight isn't just yours anymore. Elijah swallowed, nodding slowly. Clara needs treatment. Charlotte needs someone. I can't give much, but I can't let them go through this alone. Sarah tapped her pen against the desk, thinking, I can get Clara into a veterans-assisted program. Not perfect, but it'll cover emergency care while we figure out longer options. As for the child, her eyes softened as she glanced at Charlotte. You've already chosen Elijah, whether you'll admit it or not. Charlotte, still on Elijah's knee, had pulled a crumpled notebook from her backpack. With a stubby pencil, she began to draw. Her tongue poked slightly from the corner of her mouth in concentration. Minutes later, she held it up shyly. On the page, rough but heartfelt lines showed Elijah standing with Ranger by his side, both larger than life. Above them, she had written carefully in uneven letters, My Heroes. Elijah stared at the drawing, his vision blurring. The tightness in his chest broke open, and for the first time in years, tears slipped down his cheeks. He covered his mouth with one hand, overwhelmed, while Ranger pressed closer, sensing his release. Charlotte placed the notebook in his lap, her small hand resting on his arm. Sarah's voice was quiet, steady. Sometimes, meaning finds us when we've stopped looking. Elijah nodded, unable to speak, clutching the drawing like a lifeline. For so long he had believed he was nothing more than a broken soldier, a man carrying ghosts. But here, in the fragile smile of a child and the unwavering eyes of his dog, he felt something stir he thought long dead. Purpose. For the first time in years, Elijah believed he might still matter. Snow fell again that evening, the streets of Boise painted white beneath the orange glow of weary street lamps. Elijah Ward stood outside the hospital entrance, his breath clouding in the air, his hand resting gently on Ranger's head. Inside, paperwork was being pushed forward, not by Elijah's strength, but by the unseen hands of the Veterans Network Sarah Donovan had activated. For once, the machine of bureaucracy moved not against him, but with him. Clara Carter had finally been admitted. The sterile hallway smelled of antiseptic and warm plastic. Nurses wheeled a gurney past, their sneakers squeaking against linoleum. Elijah followed quietly, Ranger padding at his side, Charlotte clutching his sleeve with both hands. The girl's hair had been brushed back hastily, her pink dress still crumpled from too many nights of neglect, but her blue eyes burned bright with something new. Hope. They reached a curtained bay in the ward, where Clara lay propped up against thin pillows. A blanket was pulled to her chest, her lips cracked but touched with faint color, a line now carrying fluids into her arm. The harsh flush of fever had softened, though exhaustion still hollowed her cheeks. When she saw Elijah step inside, she struggled to lift her head. Elijah! Her voice was little more than a whisper, but her eyes spoke louder. Gratitude, apology, disbelief that someone had stood for her when even her own partner had turned away. Elijah moved to her bedside, Charlotte hurrying forward, clambering onto the chair, and then the edge of the bed. The girl pressed her small face against her mother's shoulder, sobbing quietly. Clara wrapped one frail arm around her daughter, though it trembled with the effort. I was so scared, Charlotte whispered, clutching her bear with one hand and her mother's thin fingers with the other. I know, sweetheart, Clara murmured, kissing the crown of her daughter's tangled hair. Then her gaze shifted to Elijah. She reached out, her hand weak but insistent, gripping his scarred fingers. Thank you, she breathed, her chest rising with the effort. Elijah hesitated, unused to the intimacy of another's trust. The scars on his knuckles, earned in battles overseas and in alleys at home, looked rough against Clara's pale skin. Yet, when he closed his hand around hers, something inside him steadied. Ranger settled at the foot of the bed, his amber eyes soft, tail brushing faintly against the floor, as if he understood this fragile reunion. A nurse passed by. Michael Grant, a man in his 30s with a square jaw and sandy blonde hair tucked under a blue cap. His broad shoulders carried the weariness of long shifts, and faint lines creased his forehead. But there was patience in his gray eyes, the kind of quiet strength that kept him steady in chaos. He paused, checked Clara's IV, and gave a short nod to Elijah. She'll be okay with rest and treatment. Just make sure she doesn't worry too much. His voice was calm, professional, but his faint smile suggested he recognized something more in the room than just medical care. Charlotte, still nestled close, looked up at Elijah with tear-streaked cheeks. "You stayed," she whispered, her voice trembling with both relief and awe. She reached for his hand again, squeezing tight. "Don't ever leave me, please." Elijah knelt beside the bed so his eyes were level with hers. His face, rugged and weary, softened. The lines of years of battle and loneliness seemed to ease under her gaze. "I'm here," he said simply, the words carrying more weight than he had intended. For the first time in a long while, he meant them. Clara's eyes shimmered. "She sees you as more than a stranger," she murmured, her lips curved faintly, a smile threaded with sadness and gratitude. "And maybe, so do I." Her hand tightened weakly around his. The moment lingered, fragile as glass, yet undeniable. A family, not bound by law, not by blood, but by shared wounds and fragile hope, was beginning to form in that hospital room. Ranger, silent sentinel, shifted closer and placed his head gently across Elijah's knee, as though to bind the three of them together. For the first time in years, Elijah felt that the home he thought forever lost might not be gone. It had only been waiting to be found again. Spring arrived in Boise with cautious warmth, the last traces of snow melting into streams that ran along the sidewalks. The city, once locked in the gray silence of winter, now stirred with life. Trees sprouted tender green, shop fronts cracked open their windows, and the air carried the faint scent of rain instead of frost. Elijah Ward walked with steadier steps than he had in years, his boots no longer dragging under invisible weight. Beside him trotted Ranger, his coat gleaming in the sunlight, ears pricked as if sensing the change in his master's spirit. And just behind, clutching a worn teddy bear in one hand and Elijah's calloused palm in the other, skipped Charlotte Carter, her blonde hair catching the breeze. The past months had been a trial, but hope had emerged from them. Clara Carter had been admitted under veterans-assisted coverage thanks to Sarah Donovan's network. The treatment had not been easy. Pneumonia had stolen her strength, left her frail and thin, but spring saw her recovering. She had begun to walk the hospital corridors again, leaning on rails but smiling faintly with each step. Her chestnut hair, once damp and matted with fever, now fell soft against her shoulders. Though she still carried shadows under her eyes, her gaze had gained back the spark of a mother, unwilling to let life defeat her. Elijah had been there through every day, not just as the man who had found Charlotte at the bus stop, but as someone who had become part of their story. He sat with Clara during treatments, kept Charlotte fed and laughing with Ranger's tricks, and faced paperwork that would have once sent him running. His PTSD still lingered, nights where the past clawed at his dreams, but Charlotte's drawings and Ranger's loyalty became anchors that pulled him back each time. The day of the custody hearing had been one Elijah dreaded, yet it came with unexpected grace. The courthouse smelled of old paper and floor polish, its walls lined with portraits of men in robes. At the center sat Judge Evelyn Parker, a woman in her early 60s with silver hair cropped close and eyes sharp behind square glasses. She was tall, thin, with a posture that spoke of discipline, her voice calm but carrying authority. Her reputation in Boise was one of fairness, stern with dishonesty but compassionate toward those who had walked through hardship. Clara had been present, pale but determined, sitting in her plain dress and clutching Charlotte's hand. When the moment came, her voice trembled but did not falter. "I can't care for her alone, not yet. But Elijah, he has already shown he can. He's been more of a father than Rick ever was. I trust him with her." Elijah, standing beside them, had tried to find words, but none came. His throat closed, his hands fisted at his sides. It was Charlotte who spoke for him, her small voice carrying into the quiet courtroom. She lifted her bear, now adorned with a new pink ribbon tied carefully around its neck, and said, "He's my hero. He saved me and Mama. Please let him stay." Judge Parker's stern expression softened, her glasses catching the light. She tapped her pen once against the desk, then spoke firmly. "Mr. Ward, guardianship is granted. This child remains in your care." The words had struck Elijah like a tide. For years he had wandered through life hollow, convinced he was little more than a broken soldier carrying ghosts. Now, in the eyes of a child and the trust of a mother, he had been given something larger than duty: a family. That evening, Clara sat on a hospital bench outside the ward, breathing in the spring air. She looked frail still, but there was peace in her smile. Elijah stood nearby as Charlotte proudly tied another pink ribbon around the neck of her teddy bear, the old seams of the toy frayed yet cherished. "It's for hope," she said, holding the bear up for him to see. "So we don't forget." Ranger barked once, tail wagging, as if approving. Clara reached for Elijah's hand, her fingers still thin but steady. "You didn't just save us," she whispered. "You saved yourself, too." Later on the streets of Boise, the three of them walked side by side, Elijah, Charlotte, and Ranger, shadows stretching long in the setting sun. They had no riches, no grand promises of luxury. What they carried was far greater: kindness, resilience, and the silent vow that none of them would ever be left behind again. And as Charlotte skipped forward, clutching her bear and tugging at Elijah's hand, he realized that the home he thought lost had been waiting all along in the fragile trust of a child, in the gratitude of a mother, and in the unwavering loyalty of a dog. Not wealth, not power, but mercy had saved them all. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder or angels in the sky. Sometimes they come quietly, through the worn hands of a soldier who thought he was broken, through the loyalty of a dog who never gave up, and through the fragile trust of a child who dared to hope again. When Elijah, Charlotte, and Clara found one another, it wasn't wealth or power that saved them. It was kindness, compassion, and the invisible hand of God guiding strangers into family. And isn't that what life truly is? In our everyday struggles, whether it's bills, illness, or loneliness, God still weaves small miracles around us if only we open our eyes to see them. So tonight, let their story remind us: no one is ever too lost to be found, no heart too broken to be healed, and no family too shattered to be rebuilt. If you believe God still works through ordinary people to perform extraordinary miracles, type Amen in the comments. Share this story so others may feel the same hope, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of faith, love, and redemption. May God bless you and your loved ones, today and always.